The moment I saw the certified letter taped to my front door with HOA letterhead demanding I remove my garden shed within 72 hours or face daily fines of $500, I knew my peaceful Saturday morning was about to go sideways. I had just moved into this beautiful craftsman bungalow in Asheville, North Carolina 3 months ago, and this was the first real contact I'd had with the Homeowners Association beyond the bland welcome packet that arrived in my mailbox the day after closing. My name is Ethan Donnelly, and I work as a commercial real estate attorney for a firm in downtown Asheville. The irony of an HOA trying to pull something over on someone who literally reads property documents and title searches for a living was not lost on me as I stood there in my boxer shorts and old college t-shirt, coffee mug in hand, staring at this ridiculous letter. The shed in question was a modest 8x10 structure I'd purchased from Home Depot and assembled in my backyard, painted a tasteful charcoal gray that matched my house trim perfectly. It sat behind my fence, barely visible from the street, and housed my lawnmower, gardening tools, and camping equipment. The letter was signed by one Patricia Ann Whitmore, president of the Meadowbrook Hills Homeowners Association, and it referenced some covenant from 1987 that supposedly prohibited any outbuildings, sheds, or auxiliary structures on residential lots without prior written approval from the Architectural Review Committee. The language was formal and threatening, with phrases like immediate compliance required and legal action will be pursued scattered throughout. What caught my eye, however, was a small notation at the bottom that referenced the specific covenant section. Article 7, Section 3B of the original Development Declaration. I went inside, set my coffee down on the kitchen counter, and headed straight to my home office where I kept all my closing documents in a filing cabinet. Unlike most homebuyers who probably glanced at their paperwork once and shoved it in a drawer somewhere, I had actually read every single page of my title insurance policy, the deed, and all the recorded covenants and restrictions when I bought the property. Call it professional habit or paranoia, but I always reviewed these documents thoroughly. I pulled out the thick folder and started flipping through until I found what I was looking for, the full title search report my closing attorney had ordered. The title search was comprehensive, going back 40 years, and it included copies of every recorded document that affected my property. I found the original declaration of covenants, conditions, and restrictions that had been recorded in 1987 when the Meadowbrook Hills subdivision was first developed. I scanned through the articles until I reached Article 7, Section 3B, which indeed stated exactly what Patricia's letter claimed. But then I noticed something interesting in Article 12, tucked away near the end of the document. Article 12 dealt with the duration and renewal of the covenants, and it clearly stated that these restrictions would remain in effect for an initial term of 7 years from the date of recording and would automatically renew for successive 10-year periods unless 75% of the property owners voted to amend or terminate them. I did the math in my head. The original declaration was recorded on March 12, 1987. 7 years from that date would be March 12, 1994. I grabbed my laptop and pulled up the County Register of Deeds database, which Buncombe County had thankfully digitized years ago. I searched for any amendments, renewals, or modifications to the original declaration. What I found was absolutely nothing. There was no recorded vote, no renewal document, no amendment extending the covenants past March 1994. According to my professional understanding of property law, these covenants had expired 32 years ago. The HOA had no legal authority to enforce restrictions that were no longer valid. I sat back in my office chair and let out a long breath. This was either going to be resolved very quickly, or it was going to get extremely messy. I knew from experience that HOA board members often operated on outdated information or assumptions without actually verifying the legal foundation of their authority. I spent the next hour drafting a response letter. I kept it professional but firm, citing the specific article that established the expiration date, including copies of the relevant pages from both the original declaration and the title search showing no subsequent renewals had been recorded. I concluded by politely but clearly stating that I would not be removing my shed, as the covenant in question was no longer enforceable, and that any attempt to levy fines or pursue legal action would be met with appropriate counterclaims for harassment and abuse of process. Monday morning, I printed the letter on my firm's letterhead, which probably wasn't entirely necessary, but I figured it wouldn't hurt to remind them that I was an attorney. I drove to the address listed for HOA correspondence, which turned out to be a large colonial-style house on the opposite end of the subdivision. The mailbox had Whitmore painted on it in elaborate script. Of course, Patricia ran the HOA from her own home. These busybody HOA presidents were all the same, treating their volunteer position like they were running a Fortune 500 company. I dropped the letter in her mailbox and went to work. I honestly expected that to be the end of it. Any reasonable person would receive that letter, verify the information, and back down. But I was about to learn that Patricia Ann Whitmore was not a reasonable person. Tuesday evening, I was grilling chicken on my back patio when I heard my doorbell ring. I walked through the house and opened the front door to find a woman in her early 50s standing on my porch. She had short blonde hair, styled in that aggressive mom haircut that seemed to be standard issue for HOA board members, and she wore pressed khaki capri pants with a pale pink polo shirt. Her expression was somewhere between outraged and constipated. "Are you Ethan Donnelly?" she demanded before I could even say hello. "That's me. And you are?" "Patricia Whitmore, HOA president. We need to talk about your letter." I leaned against the doorframe. "Okay, talk." Her eyes narrowed at my casual tone. "You cannot just decide to ignore HOA rules because you think you found some technicality. That shed is an eyesore and it violates our community standards." "First of all," I said, keeping my voice level, "it's not a technicality. The covenants expired in 1994. That's 32 years ago. Second, you can't even see the shed from the street. It's in my fenced backyard. Third, what exactly gives you the authority to enforce rules that don't legally exist anymore?" Patricia's face was starting to turn pink. "The HOA has always enforced these standards. Just because some paperwork wasn't filed doesn't mean the rules don't apply. Everyone in this neighborhood knows about the restrictions." "That's not how property law works," I said. "Covenants aren't enforced based on what everyone knows or what has always been done. They're enforced based on what's actually recorded and legally binding. Your declaration had a built-in expiration clause. Nobody renewed it. End of story." "I don't care what your fancy lawyer letter says. The board voted 3 years ago to update our bylaws, and those bylaws include the same restrictions." Now this was interesting. "Did you record those updated bylaws with the county?" She blinked. "What?" "Covenants and restrictions that run with the land have to be recorded with the Register of Deeds. Otherwise, they're just internal rules that don't have any legal force. So did you record them?" The silence told me everything I needed to know. "I'll take that as a no," I said. "Look, Patricia, I don't want trouble. I bought this house, I did my due diligence, and according to the law, I have no obligation to follow expired covenants or unrecorded bylaws. If you want to establish new restrictions for the neighborhood, you need to follow the proper legal process. Get an attorney, draft new covenants, get them signed by all the property owners, and record them. Until then, my shed stays." "This isn't over," Patricia said, her voice shaking with anger. "The board will be hearing about this, and we will take legal action if necessary." "You're welcome to try," I said, "but I promise you don't want to go down that road. Have a good evening." I closed the door before she could respond. Through the window, I watched her stomp back to her car, her whole body radiating fury. I had a sinking feeling that this was just the beginning. Sure enough, the next few weeks turned into an escalating campaign of petty harassment. First, I received another certified letter informing me that I was now in violation of 7 different HOA rules, including having my trash cans visible from the street on non-collection days. They were beside my garage for literally 2 hours before trash pickup. Parking my personal truck in my driveway instead of my garage. Apparently vehicles had to be garaged overnight. And allowing my grass to exceed 4 inches in height. It was 3.5 inches, I measured. Each violation came with the same threat of $500 daily fines. I responded to each letter with the same basic message. The underlying covenants had expired, and therefore the HOA had no enforcement authority. I also started documenting everything with photos and timestamps. Then, Patricia got creative. She started showing up at my house at random times, always with a clipboard and a camera, photographing my property from the sidewalk. She would stand there for 10 or 15 minutes, writing notes and making a big show of documenting every perceived violation. When I ignored her, she started knocking on my door to personally inform me of new violations. I stopped answering. The situation reached a new level of absurdity when I came home from work one Thursday to find a bright orange sticker plastered on my front door declaring that my property was in violation of community standards and subject to immediate fines. The sticker was the size of a sheet of paper and had left adhesive residue all over my door. I spent 20 minutes scraping it off with a putty knife. That weekend, I attended a neighborhood cookout hosted by my next-door neighbor, Marcus, who had lived in Meadowbrook Hills for 15 years. We were standing around his grill with cold beers when I brought up the HOA situation. "Oh man, Patricia is relentless," Marcus said, shaking his head. "She's been president for like 8 years, and she treats this place like it's her personal fiefdom. Most people just go along with whatever she says because it's easier than fighting." "Has anyone ever challenged her before?" "A couple times. There was a guy 4 years ago who wanted to build a deck and she denied it for some ridiculous reason. He threatened to sue, but eventually just gave up and moved. Then there was a woman who painted her house the wrong shade of beige without approval. Patricia fined her into oblivion until she repainted." "Did anyone actually pay those fines?" Marcus took a sip of his beer. "I think most people did, yeah. Patricia has this whole routine where she files liens against your property if you don't pay, and she claims she can foreclose. I don't know if that's actually true, but people get scared." "It's not true if the underlying covenants aren't valid," I said. "She can't file a legitimate lien based on expired restrictions." "You should talk to Dennis," Marcus said. "Dennis Burke. He lives over on Maple Court. He's a retired real estate broker, and he's been butting heads with Patricia for years over this same issue. He keeps saying the HOA doesn't have any real authority anymore, but nobody listens." I got Dennis's number from Marcus and called him that evening. Dennis answered on the third ring, and when I explained the situation, he actually laughed. "Welcome to the resistance," Dennis said. "I've been telling people for a decade that those covenants expired, and Patricia is just making things up as she goes. Nobody believes me because she's got the title and the official letterhead, and people assume that means she has actual power. Why hasn't anyone taken her to court? Because it costs money and time, and most people don't want the hassle. Patricia knows this. She counts on people rolling over. The few who have fought back usually just end up moving because she makes their lives miserable. She's got a whole network of people on the board who support her, and they all feed off the drama." "Well, I'm not moving," I said, "and I'm definitely not taking down my shed. If she wants to push this, I'll push back." "Good," Dennis said. "It's about time someone stood up to her. Let me know if you need anything. I've got boxes of old HOA documents and correspondence that might be useful." Over the next few days, I did some more research. I pulled the incorporation documents for the Meadowbrook Hills HOA from the North Carolina Secretary of State website and discovered that the HOA had been formally dissolved in 2003 for failure to file annual reports. Someone had reincorporated it in 2011, but the new entity had no recorded covenants or restrictions attached to it. Essentially, the current HOA was a social club with no legal enforcement power whatsoever. Armed with this information, I drafted a comprehensive legal memo outlining the entire situation: the expired covenants, the lack of recorded renewals, the dissolved and reincorporated HOA entity, and the absence of any valid legal authority for the board to enforce restrictions or levy fines. I sent copies to Patricia, every board member I could identify, and posted it on the neighborhood's Facebook group. The response was immediate and explosive. My phone started ringing within hours. Neighbors I'd never met were calling to ask questions, some angry that I was causing trouble, others thrilled that someone was finally challenging Patricia's authority. The Facebook post generated over 100 comments in the first day, with the neighborhood splitting into two camps: those who supported the HOA and thought I was being a troublemaker, and those who were sick of Patricia's overbearing management style and grateful someone was exposing the legal reality. Patricia's response came in the form of a certified letter from an attorney. I almost felt relieved when it arrived. At least now we were dealing with actual legal counsel instead of Patricia's angry rants. The letter was from a solo practitioner named Robert Hutchins, whose office was in a strip mall across town. It demanded that I remove the shed, pay $3,000 in accumulated fines for various violations, and cease making defamatory statements about the HOA board. I called Robert's office and scheduled a meeting for the following week. When I walked into his cramped office on Tuesday afternoon, he looked surprised to see me carrying a briefcase and wearing a suit. "Mr. Donnelly, thanks for coming in," Robert said, shaking my hand. He was in his 60s, slightly overweight, with thinning gray hair and an air of weariness that suggested he'd been practicing small-town law for too long. "Happy to," I said, "though I'm not sure why we're meeting. Your letter doesn't have much legal foundation." Robert gestured for me to sit. "Look, I'm going to be straight with you. Patricia hired me to send that letter, but after reviewing the documents she provided, I have some concerns about the HOA's position." "The covenants expired 32 years ago," I said, "and the original HOA entity was dissolved. The current board has no legal authority." "I'm aware," Robert said with a sigh. "I've tried explaining this to Patricia, but she insists that the HOA has always enforced these rules, and that means they're valid. She doesn't seem to understand that property law doesn't work that way." "So why did you send the letter?" "Because she's paying me to represent the HOA, and I'm obligated to present her position, even if I think it's weak. But I'm not going to file a lawsuit that has no merit. I told her that if she wants to pursue this further, she needs to find another attorney." I respected his honesty. "What happens now?" "Honestly, I'm going to recommend that the HOA board drops this matter entirely. They have no case. If they try to file liens or continue harassing you, you'd have legitimate grounds for a suit against them for abuse of process and possibly harassment. Patricia won't like hearing that, but it's the truth." We shook hands, and I left feeling somewhat vindicated. But I knew Patricia well enough by now to know she wouldn't give up just because her own attorney told her she was wrong. I was right. 2 days later, I received notice that the HOA was holding a special meeting to vote on addressing problem properties in the neighborhood. The meeting was scheduled for Saturday morning at Patricia's house, and all homeowners were invited to attend. The notice made no specific mention of me, but it was obvious I was the target. Saturday morning, I drove to Patricia's house and found about 40 people already gathered in her spacious living room and spilling into the dining room. Patricia stood at the front of the room with a microphone and a projection screen, looking like she was about to deliver a corporate presentation. When I walked in, the room went quiet and heads turned. "Mr. Donnelly," Patricia said, her voice dripping with false politeness, "how nice of you to join us." "Wouldn't miss it," I said, finding a spot to stand near the back. Patricia launched into a PowerPoint presentation that was equal parts impressive and unhinged. She had photos of my shed, my trash cans, my truck parked in my driveway, and even close-ups of my grass. She had charts showing the alleged decline in property values when covenant enforcement was lax. She had testimonials from neighbors about how important community standards were. It was simultaneously professional and completely divorced from legal reality. And this is why," Patricia concluded, "we need to take decisive action against homeowners who refuse to follow our rules. I'm proposing that the board be authorized to move forward with placing liens on properties that have outstanding fines and to pursue legal action as necessary." "You can't do that," I said from the back of the room. Patricia's smile was sharp. "Excuse me? You can't place liens based on fines that have no legal foundation. The covenants expired in 1994. Your attorney already told you the HOA has no enforcement authority. This whole meeting is a waste of everyone's time." "That's your opinion," Patricia snapped. "We have legal counsel that says otherwise." "No, you don't," I said. "Robert Hutchins told you he wouldn't file suit because you have no case. If you have different legal counsel who says otherwise, I'd love to hear from them." Patricia's face flushed red. "You have no right to come here and disrupt this meeting." "This is supposed to be a homeowners association meeting," I said. "I'm a homeowner. I have every right to be here and to speak." An older woman near the front raised her hand. "Patricia, is what he's saying true? Did our attorney really say we don't have a case?" "That attorney didn't understand the full situation," Patricia said quickly. We're consulting with another firm. Which firm? I asked. Patricia ignored me. We're going to take a vote on authorizing the board to pursue collections and legal action. All in favor. You can't vote on something that's illegal. Dennis Burke's voice cut through the room. I turned to see him standing near the doorway. I hadn't noticed him come in. Patricia, you need to stop this nonsense before you expose the entire board to personal liability. Dennis, you've never supported this board. Because this board has been operating outside its legal authority for years, Dennis said, walking further into the room. The covenants expired. The original HOA dissolved. You reconstituted a new corporation, but never properly established new recorded restrictions. Right now, you're just a social club playing pretend government, and if you start trying to collect fines and place liens based on invalid claims, every board member in this room can be sued personally. The room erupted in crosstalk. Some people were demanding to know if this was true, others were defending Patricia, and a few were arguing amongst themselves. Patricia was banging her hand on the table, trying to restore order. "Everyone calm down!" Patricia shouted. "This is exactly the kind of chaos these troublemakers want to create. We have maintained community standards in Meadowbrook Hills for decades, and we're not going to let one person come in and destroy everything we've built." "You haven't built anything," I said. "You've been coasting on expired legal documents and intimidating people who didn't know any better. But the second you try to actually enforce these fake rules in court, everything falls apart." A man in his 40s wearing a golf shirt stood up. "I'm on the board, and honestly, this is the first I'm hearing about any of this expiration issue. Patricia, did you know the covenants had expired when you sent out those violation letters?" Patricia's mouth opened and closed. "The covenants are still valid in spirit." "That's not how law works," the man said. "If what they're saying is true, and we've been threatening people with fines based on expired covenants, the HOA could be sued into oblivion." "We need to table this discussion until we get proper legal advice," another board member said. The meeting devolved into arguments and confusion. Patricia tried to maintain control, but it was clear she'd lost the room. Eventually, people started leaving in small groups, many of them stopping to ask me questions on their way out. Dennis and I ended up standing on Patricia's front lawn with a small crowd of curious neighbors, explaining the legal situation in detail. "So wait," one woman said. "You're telling me I didn't have to repaint my mailbox last year? If you were ordered to do it based on the old covenants?" "No, you didn't have to," I said. "I spent $400 on that." More stories came flooding out. People who had been fined for minor violations, people who had been denied permission to make reasonable improvements to their own property, people who had paid thousands of dollars over the years to stay in compliance with rules that apparently didn't exist. The anger was palpable. Patricia appeared in her doorway. "Get off my property, all of you. This meeting is over." "The meeting was at your house," Dennis pointed out. "You invited everyone here. And now I'm uninviting you. Leave or I'll call the police." We relocated to Dennis's house, where about 15 neighbors gathered to discuss next steps. The consensus was clear. Patricia had been operating the HOA like her personal dictatorship for too long, and it was time for change. Several people wanted to vote her out as president immediately. Others wanted to dissolve the HOA entirely. A few suggested suing to recover money they'd spent on forced compliance. The problem is, Dennis explained, we need to figure out what we actually want. Do we want to establish new, proper covenants for the neighborhood? Do we want an HOA at all? Or do we want to just let everyone do whatever they want with their property? The discussion went on for over 2 hours. Eventually, we agreed that Dennis would organize a proper neighborhood-wide meeting, separate from Patricia's board, to discuss the options. In the meantime, everyone was advised to ignore any further violation notices or fine demands from the HOA. I thought things might calm down after that. I was very wrong. The following week, I came home from work to find that someone had spray-painted HOA Trader across my driveway in bright red paint. I stood there staring at it, actually more amazed than angry. This was so petty and juvenile that it almost wrapped back around to being funny. Almost. I called the police non-emergency line and filed a report, then spent my evening pressure washing my driveway. 2 days later, someone left a bag of dog feces on my front porch. Then my mailbox was knocked over in the middle of the night. Then I got an anonymous letter in my mail telling me I should move out of the neighborhood because I wasn't welcome. I started keeping a detailed log of every incident, complete with photos and timestamps. I also installed a Ring doorbell camera and 2 additional security cameras covering my front yard and driveway. The vandalism stopped once the cameras went up, but the harassment continued in other forms. Patricia started a whisper campaign, telling neighbors that I was going to bring down their property values, that I was planning to turn my house into a rental property, that I was difficult and litigious. Some people believed her. I got cold shoulders at the grocery store from neighbors I'd barely met. Someone left a note on my windshield at the gym calling me selfish, but others rallied to support me. Dennis organized the neighborhood meeting for a Sunday afternoon at the community clubhouse. Over 60 people showed up, which was apparently unprecedented for a neighborhood gathering. Patricia and her core supporters sat in one section, arms crossed and faces hostile. Everyone else scattered around the room. Dennis stood at the front and laid out the facts clearly and calmly. He explained the expired covenants, showed the documentation, and outlined the legal reality of the situation. He then opened the floor for discussion about what people wanted to do moving forward. The meeting was contentious. Patricia's supporters argued that we needed strict rules to maintain property values and neighborhood character. Others argued for personal freedom and property rights. Some people just wanted the drama to end and didn't care either way. A few were angry about money they'd spent complying with invalid rules and wanted restitution. After 2 hours of debate, Dennis called for a series of votes. First, whether to remove Patricia as HOA president. The vote was 51-9 in favor of removal. Patricia stood up, grabbed her purse, and stormed out of the clubhouse without a word, her supporters trailing behind her. Second, whether to dissolve the HOA entirely or establish new recorded covenants. This vote was much closer, but the majority favored dissolving the HOA. People were tired of the drama and expense, and most felt that Asheville's city codes were sufficient to prevent any serious property maintenance issues. The final vote was to authorize Dennis to file the necessary paperwork to formally dissolve the homeowners association and notify all homeowners that no covenants or restrictions were in effect. I actually felt bad for Patricia, in a distant sort of way. She'd devoted years to this organization, probably genuinely believing she was helping the neighborhood. But she'd gotten so wrapped up in the power and control that she'd lost sight of reality and pushed things way too far. I didn't see Patricia for several weeks after that meeting. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she was furious and talking about suing everyone involved, but nothing materialized. Life slowly returned to normal. The HOA officially dissolved. People started doing small projects they'd been putting off. One neighbor built a nice patio. Another put in a vegetable garden. Someone painted their house a shade of blue that probably would have sent Patricia into cardiac arrest. My shed remained exactly where it was, quietly housing my lawnmower and camping gear. Then, about 3 months after the dissolution of the HOA, I got a call from the Buncombe County Sheriff's Office. A deputy asked if I could come down to answer some questions about the Meadowbrook Hills HOA. Confused, I agreed to meet them the next day. The deputy who greeted me was a sharp-eyed woman in her 30s named Officer Ramirez. She led me to a small interview room and explained that they were investigating financial irregularities related to the HOA. "We received a complaint from several residents about missing funds," Officer Ramirez explained. "When the HOA was dissolved, the transition team tried to do a final accounting of the association's finances. They discovered that approximately $47,000 was unaccounted for." I let out a low whistle. That's a lot of money. The HOA collected annual dues and various fines over the years. According to the bank statements, significant withdrawals were made over the past 3 years that don't correspond to any documented expenses. We're talking to everyone who was involved with the HOA board to try to piece together what happened. "Patricia Whitmore was the president and treasurer," I said. "She controlled everything." "We're aware. We've been trying to contact Mrs. Whitmore, but she's not returning calls. Her neighbors say she hasn't been home in over a week." A chill ran down my spine. "You think she took the money and ran?" "We're not making any conclusions yet, but we'd like to know if you have any documentation or information about HOA finances. I told her everything I knew, which wasn't much regarding the financial side. I'd never paid any attention to the HOA's money because I'd been focused on the legal issues with the covenants. Officer Ramirez took notes and thanked me for my time. 2 days later, the story broke in the Asheville Citizen-Times. Patricia Ann Whitmore was being sought by authorities in connection with embezzlement from the Meadowbrook Hills HOA. The article detailed how she had allegedly been siphoning funds from the HOA accounts for over 3 years, using the money for personal expenses, including a new car, vacations, and home renovations. The total amount missing was now estimated at over $50,000. The neighborhood Facebook group exploded. People were posting screenshots of dues payments they'd made, fines they'd paid, and special assessments Patricia had demanded over the years for various maintenance and legal expenses. Everyone was trying to figure out how much of their money had ended up in Patricia's pocket. Dennis called me that evening. "Did you see the news?" "Hard to miss it," I said. "This is insane." "I'm not entirely surprised," Dennis admitted. Patricia always had expensive tastes, and she was very secretive about the HOA finances. Whenever anyone asked to see the books, she'd get defensive and say it was board business. I should have pushed harder. "This isn't your fault. She was the one committing fraud. The sheriff's office contacted me too. They want me to help go through all the old HOA records. Apparently Patricia kept terrible documentation of where the money went. It's going to be a mess to sort out." It took another week for the authorities to locate Patricia. She'd driven to her sister's house in Tennessee and had been hiding out there, according to the news reports. When deputies finally tracked her down, she initially refused to return to North Carolina and had to be extradited. The whole situation was surreal. The legal process moved slowly, as these things do. Patricia was charged with felony embezzlement, obtaining property by false pretenses, and fraud. The prosecution alleged that over a 3-year period, she had systematically diverted HOA funds for personal use while maintaining fake records to cover her tracks. The amounts were significant enough that she was facing serious prison time if convicted. Meanwhile, the former residents of the now-dissolved HOA were dealing with the fallout. A class action lawsuit was filed against Patricia personally to try to recover the stolen funds, but her assets were tied up in legal proceedings. Her husband, a quiet accountant I'd seen around the neighborhood a few times, filed for divorce. The whole thing was a spectacular implosion. I attended the preliminary hearing out of curiosity. Patricia looked haggard, her trademark aggressive demeanor replaced by a quiet desperation. Her attorney, a public defender who looked overwhelmed, argued for reduced bail. The judge wasn't sympathetic, especially after the prosecutor detailed Patricia's attempt to flee the state. Bail was set at $50,000, which Patricia couldn't make. She was remanded to custody pending trial. Over the following months, more details emerged. Patricia had started small, skimming a few $100s here and there to cover personal expenses when her husband's accounting business had hit a rough patch. But as she got away with it, she got bolder. The fake fines she'd levied against various homeowners, including me, had gone straight into her pocket. The legal fees she'd claimed the HOA was paying didn't exist. The maintenance assessments for common areas had never been spent on actual maintenance. It was a textbook case of someone in a position of minor authority letting the power go to their head and then using that position for personal gain. The sad thing was that if Patricia had just been a reasonable HOA president, none of this would have happened. But her aggressive enforcement tactics and need for control had ultimately led to her own exposure and downfall. The trial took place the following spring. I was called as a witness to testify about the fines Patricia had tried to levy against me and her refusal to back down even after her own attorney told her she had no legal standing. The prosecutor used my case as an example of how Patricia had been inventing violations and fines to generate money for herself. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Patricia was found guilty on all counts. At sentencing, she finally broke down and apologized, claiming she'd been under financial stress and made terrible choices. The judge gave her 6 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 3 and ordered her to pay restitution to all the affected homeowners. The restitution was going to be complicated because Patricia had already spent most of the money. Her assets, including her house, were liquidated to partially repay what she owed, but most people in the neighborhood accepted they'd never see their money again. At least there was a sense of justice being served, and the truth had come out. As for me, life in Meadowbrook Hills finally settled into the quiet suburban existence I'd wanted when I bought the house. Without the HOA and Patricia's constant interference, people were actually friendlier and more relaxed. The neighborhood didn't descend into chaos like Patricia had always warned. Property values stayed stable. People took care of their homes because they had pride in ownership, not because someone was threatening them with fines. My shed stood proudly in my backyard, a small wooden monument to the principle that property rights matter and people shouldn't just blindly accept what they're told by self-appointed authorities. I added a small vegetable garden next to it, something that definitely would have violated the old covenants. I planted tomatoes, peppers, and zucchini and enjoyed fresh vegetables all summer. Dennis became a good friend. We had barbecues on weekends and occasionally met for beers to laugh about the absurdity of the whole situation. He was working on a detailed history of the HOA saga, documenting everything from the original covenant expiration to Patricia's criminal trial. He planned to post it online as a cautionary tale for other neighborhoods dealing with overreaching HOAs. I also started doing pro bono legal work for homeowners in other parts of Asheville who were having disputes with their HOAs. Word had spread about what happened in Meadowbrook Hills, and I was getting calls from people asking me to review their covenants and restrictions. I discovered that expired or improperly recorded covenants were surprisingly common. A lot of HOAs were operating on autopilot, enforcing rules that hadn't been legally valid in years or even decades, simply because nobody had ever bothered to check. I helped a young couple in West Asheville fight back against their HOA that was trying to ban solar panels. Their covenants were from the 1990s and made no mention of solar energy, and North Carolina law now protected homeowners' rights to install solar panels regardless of HOA restrictions. The HOA backed down after I sent them a detailed letter citing the relevant statutes. I assisted an elderly widow who was being fined because she couldn't afford to repaint her house. The HOA had been demanding she paint it every 5 years per their rules, but her fixed income couldn't cover the cost. When I reviewed her documents, I found the aesthetic restrictions in her covenants had expired after 20 years, and that deadline had passed 6 years earlier. The fines were dropped. Each case reinforced the same lesson. HOAs only have the power that people give them, and much of that power is based on intimidation and assumptions rather than actual legal authority. When someone finally stands up and demands proof of that authority, the whole facade often crumbles. About a year after everything went down, I was doing some yard work on a Saturday afternoon when a car pulled up and a young couple got out. They introduced themselves as prospective homebuyers who were looking at a house down the street. They'd heard about the HOA situation and wanted to know if the neighborhood was a good place to live. "It's a great neighborhood," I told them honestly. "The people are friendly, the location is convenient, and the drama is over. No HOA, no restrictions beyond city codes, just regular people living their lives." "We've been burned by HOAs before," the woman said. "Our last neighborhood had someone a lot like your Patricia. She made our lives miserable until we finally moved." "That's exactly why I fought back," I said. "Someone has to draw a line. If everyone just accepts the abuse, these petty tyrants keep getting away with it." They thanked me for my time and went to look at the house. I learned later they made an offer and moved in a month after that. They became good neighbors, and we occasionally got together for dinner parties. The whole experience taught me several important lessons. First, always read the fine print on any property documents. Most people sign closing paperwork without understanding what they're agreeing to, and that ignorance can be exploited. Second, just because someone has a title and official letterhead doesn't mean they have actual legal authority. Always verify. Third, standing up to bullies is hard and can get messy, but it's worth it. If I had just taken down my shed and paid Patricia's fake fines, she would have continued terrorizing the neighborhood and stealing money for who knows how long. My shed, now a couple years old, was weathering nicely. I'd added some shelving inside to better organize my tools, and I'd planted climbing roses along one side that bloomed beautifully each spring. Every time I looked at it, I smiled. It represented more than just a storage building. It was a reminder that you don't have to accept other people's unjust rules just because they say so. Sometimes you have to stand your ground, do your research, and fight back. Meadowbrook Hills had become exactly the kind of neighborhood I'd hoped to find when I moved to Asheville. Quiet streets lined with mature oak trees, friendly neighbors who waved when they saw you, kids riding bikes, people walking dogs. No aggressive HOA president prowling around with a clipboard. No threatening letters about minor violations. No fear that you might be fined for having your trash can out an hour too early or planting the wrong color flowers. Dennis finished his written history of the HOA saga and posted it on several online forums dedicated to HOA horror stories. It went viral in those circles, getting thousands of views and comments from people sharing their own experiences with overreaching associations. He gave talks at a few local community centers about property rights and covenant enforcement. He became something of an amateur expert on HOA issues. I continued my regular law practice, but the HOA cases I took on the side became some of the most satisfying work I did. There's something deeply gratifying about helping regular people stand up to institutional bullying. The law firms I worked for on big commercial deals paid the bills, but the homeowners I helped fight back against unjust HOA enforcement fed my soul. One case in particular stood out. A family in South Asheville contacted me because their HOA was trying to force them to remove a wheelchair ramp they'd installed for their disabled teenage son. The HOA claimed the ramp was an unapproved structure that violated aesthetic standards. I was able to cite the Fair Housing Act and Americans with Disabilities Act, both of which prohibit HOAs from preventing reasonable accommodations for disabled residents. The HOA dropped their complaint within 48 hours of receiving my letter, and I didn't even charge the family for my time. Stories like that reminded me why I'd gone to law school in the first place. Not to bill hours and negotiate commercial leases, though that was part of it, but to help people navigate complex legal systems and protect their rights. The Patricia Whitmore situation had inadvertently given me a new mission and purpose. As for Patricia herself, she served 3 years in a minimum security facility before being released on parole. I heard through the grapevine that she moved to a different state to live with family and start over. Part of me hoped she'd learn something from the experience, though I suspected she probably still believed she'd been right and everyone else had been wrong. People like Patricia rarely developed self-awareness even after facing serious consequences. Her ex-husband still lived in Meadowbrook Hills, actually. He'd been completely blindsided by the embezzlement and fraud, apparently having no idea what Patricia had been doing with the HOA money. He kept a low profile, but occasionally I'd see him at the grocery store, and we'd exchange polite nods. I felt bad for him. He'd lost his wife, his reputation had taken a hit by association, and he'd been dragged through an ugly divorce and criminal trial. None of it had been his fault. The house Patricia had lived in was sold to pay restitution, and a nice retired couple moved in. They were quiet and friendly, the kind of neighbors everyone wants. The woman liked to garden, and she transformed Patricia's formerly pristine and sterile lawn into a colorful wildflower meadow that attracted butterflies and bees. It was a fitting metaphor for the neighborhood's transformation from rigid control to organic freedom. 3 years after the whole thing started, I was sitting on my back deck on a warm summer evening, beer in hand, looking at my shed. The setting sun painted everything in golden light. The shed's charcoal gray paint had faded slightly, giving it a pleasant weathered look. The climbing roses were in full bloom, their pink petals catching the evening light. My vegetable garden was thriving, with tomato plants heavy with ripening fruit. Marcus came over from next door, carrying his own beer, and settled into one of my deck chairs. "Beautiful evening," he said. "Sure is." "Hard to believe all that crazy stuff went down just a few years ago," Marcus mused. "Seems like a lifetime ago now." "Yeah," I agreed, "but it worked out in the end." "You ever regret getting involved? Fighting back against Patricia? It was a lot of stress and drama." I thought about it for a moment. "No," I said finally. "I don't regret it. If I hadn't stood up to her, she'd probably still be running the HOA like a dictator and stealing money. Someone had to say enough. "Well, the neighborhood is better for it," Marcus said, raising his beer bottle. "To expired covenants and standing up to bullies." I clinked my bottle against his. "I'll drink to that." We sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun sink below the horizon. Somewhere down the street, kids were playing, their laughter carrying on the evening breeze. A dog barked, someone was grilling, and the smell of burgers and charcoal smoke drifted through the air. It was perfectly, wonderfully ordinary. My phone buzzed with an email. Another homeowner in a different Asheville neighborhood asking if I could review their HOA covenants because they were being threatened with fines for installing a fence. I made a mental note to respond on Monday, another battle against another overreaching HOA. Some things never changed, but I'd learned that fighting these battles was worthwhile. Every homeowner who stood up to unjust HOA enforcement made it a little bit harder for the next Patricia Whitmore to abuse her power. Every expired covenant that was properly identified and called out weakened the foundation of false authority these organizations often stood on. Every person who said, "Prove it," instead of just paying the fine, chipped away at the intimidation and fear these boards relied on. My shed had become a minor legend in certain HOA fighting circles online. Dennis's write-up of the story had included photos, and people loved the image of this modest gray storage building that had toppled an entire HOA regime. I'd gotten emails from people across the country telling me their own shed stories, their own battles with petty neighborhood dictators. It was strangely heartwarming to know I wasn't alone in this experience. As darkness fell and Marcus headed home, I stayed on the deck a while longer. Fireflies were starting to emerge, their bioluminescent flashes creating a magical atmosphere in the growing dark. I could hear crickets and tree frogs beginning their nightly chorus. This was what I'd wanted when I bought this house: peace, quiet, and the freedom to enjoy my own property without some busybody telling me what I could and couldn't do. The title search that had started everything sat in my filing cabinet inside, pristine pages documenting the legal history of my property. Those pages had been my shield and sword, the proof that Patricia's claims were hollow. Every homeowner should do that level of research, I thought. Know what you're actually obligated to do versus what someone claims you're obligated to do. Knowledge was power, especially when facing down an aggressive HOA. I finished my beer and went inside, locking up for the night. Tomorrow I'd mow the lawn, maybe do some weeding in the garden, normal weekend homeowner tasks. No one would be watching with a clipboard, documenting violations. No certified letters would arrive threatening fines. No Patricia would show up to lecture me about community standards. Just peaceful, private enjoyment of my own home. As I got ready for bed, I thought about the circuitous journey that had led to this moment of peace, the ridiculous violation letter about my shed, the research into expired covenants, the confrontations with Patricia, the neighborhood meetings, the vandalism, the embezzlement investigation, the trial. It had been exhausting and stressful, but ultimately necessary. Sometimes the right thing to do is also the hard thing to do. Standing up to Patricia would have been much easier if I'd just been fighting for myself, but knowing that she was harassing and intimidating an entire neighborhood made it personal. Discovering she was stealing from everyone made it criminal. Seeing her finally face justice for her actions made all the struggle worthwhile. I turned off the lights and climbed into bed. Through my bedroom window, I could see the stars, brilliant and clear in the mountain sky. Asheville was a good place to live. Meadowbrook Hills was a good neighborhood. My Craftsman bungalow was a perfect house. And my 8x10 gray shed, barely visible in the dark backyard, was right where it belonged. The covenant Patricia had tried to enforce had expired in 1994, 30 years before I'd even bought the house. My title search had revealed the truth and ended that conversation fast. Everything that followed the confrontations, the investigations, the trial had stemmed from that simple fact. The legal foundation of Patricia's authority didn't exist. It was a lesson worth remembering and worth sharing. Question authority, especially when that authority claims power over your property and your life. Demand proof. Do your research. Stand your ground when you know you're right. Don't let bullies win just because fighting back is uncomfortable or difficult. And always, always read your title search documents. You never know when they might save you from an expired covenant and an embezzling HOA president. I smiled in the darkness and drifted off to sleep, content in the knowledge that my shed was safe, my rights were intact, and Patricia Ann Whitmore was exactly where she deserved to be. Out of power, out of my neighborhood, and out of my life. The end.